Marion Hall never thought the old barn on the edge of her property would become the center of her life, and certainly not the center of a storm that would threaten everything she had worked for. The barn was not just a weathered structure of wood and beams. It was the last tangible reminder of her parents, who had poured years of labor and love into keeping the land alive, even when the world seemed intent on swallowing small family. Property's whole. Marion had inherited it 3 years ago after the passing of her father, a man who had always said that buildings carried the weight of memory, and if you took care of them properly, they would carry you in return. As an architect who had spent her career reshaping other people's visions into tangible structures, Marion found something deeply grounding about restoring a place that was hers alone. Not a commission, not a project subject to clients or committees, but an inheritance that tethered her to a history she was not ready to let go of. She lived alone now, at 42, in the small house adjacent to the barn, a widow whose husband had died far too young in a car accident that left her carrying grief like a second skin. The house was modest, but the barn was her escape, her canvas, her refuge. Every weekend she carried rolls of sketches out there, setting them on the wide work tables she had salvaged from an old studio, and spent hours under the filtered light that passed through the cracked slats and dusty windows. She dreamed of turning the barn into her permanent workspace, an architectural studio where she could blend her professional life with her personal need for quiet, surrounded by the smell of old wood and the ghost of her father's tools that still hung on the far wall. The thought of selling the place or letting it fall apart had never crossed her mind. It was not just property, it was continuity, and after the chaos of loss, she needed continuity more than anything else. The neighborhood itself was deceptively calm, a semi-rural community that had slowly been encroached upon by suburban sprawl and the invisible net of its homeowners association. Marion had never paid much attention to them. She was not the type to gossip with neighbors or attend board meetings where people argued about the height of fences or the shade of beige approved for exterior walls. She valued her solitude, and as long as her property taxes were paid and the lawn looked respectable, she assumed the association would have no reason to bother her. She had heard stories, of course, of HOAs that micromanaged their residents' lives, issuing fines for trivial infractions and expanding their authority into every corner of private property. But she told herself that such things were exaggerated, or at least unlikely to reach her barn. After all, what threat could an old wooden structure pose to a neighborhood lined with modernized houses? Marion's daily rhythm was steady. Mornings spent drafting for her clients, afternoons dedicated to site visits or calls, evenings reserved for quiet reading or sketching alone in the barn. The place carried silence in a way that the house did not. The walls held back the world, the rafters echoed softly with her pencil strokes, and the air smelled of hay and sawdust, remnants of a time when the barn had been filled with animals and harvest rather than blueprints. Neighbors sometimes waved as they passed, but she rarely stopped for long conversations. It was not that she disliked people, but rather that she preferred the unbroken focus of her work and the gentle company of memory. She was content to remain in the periphery of neighborhood life, convinced that her independence was shield enough against intrusion. In the quiet of those early evenings when the sky blushed with orange before fading into dusk, Marion often stood outside the barn and felt a sense of gratitude that she had this place to herself, unclaimed, untouched by others. She knew the building needed work. Its foundation was sturdy, but the roof sagged in one corner, and sometimes rain found its way through loose shingles. But instead of discouraging her, those imperfections felt like an invitation, as though her father had left her a challenge to finish what he had started. She would run her hands along the weathered boards, tracing grooves where his tools had once leaned, imagining how the space would look once she restored it fully, perhaps with tall windows to bring in more light, or a mezzanine level where she could keep models and archives. It was not just about architecture anymore. It was about reclaiming a future that still felt possible, even after years of loss. If someone had asked her then whether she feared interference from the association, she would have laughed. To her, the HOA was a background nuisance at worst. A bureaucratic machine that mailed newsletters and collected fees, but had no real interest in someone who kept to herself. She believed, perhaps naively, that property rights were straightforward, that what was hers would remain hers as long as she protected it. The barn had been in her family for decades, older than most of the houses now dotting the neighborhood, and she took a comfort in that longevity. She did not see how quickly things could change, how easily paper and signatures could distort truth, and how the same neighbors who smiled politely could turn complicit in silence when confronted by authority. For now, Marian saw only the calm before the storm, unaware that the barn she cherished was already marked in documents she had never signed, already claimed by people who saw in it not memory or meaning, but opportunity. It was a Saturday evening when Marian first realized that something was terribly wrong, a day that had begun with the quiet satisfaction of work in her studio and ended with the unnerving sensation that she had stepped into a life that was no longer hers. She had spent the afternoon sketching in the barn, the late summer sun streaming through the gaps in the siding, and when she left to pick up groceries from a nearby market, she locked the doors as she always did, feeling secure in the belief that her barn was nothing more than her sanctuary, a place so personal and unremarkable to others that it could never attract unwanted attention. Yet when she returned 2 hours later, as dusk settled over the neighborhood and the air thickened with the scent of cut grass and barbecue smoke, she turned down her driveway and was startled to find it lined with vehicles she did not recognize. Sleek sedans, rental vans, even a limousine idling at the side of the road, its headlights casting pale cones across the gravel. At first, she thought there must have been some mistake, perhaps a neighbor hosting a party whose guests had parked on her property, but as she slowed the car and saw the barn illuminated with strings of golden lights, its doors flung wide to reveal tables draped in linen and a crowd of formally dressed strangers holding champagne glasses, her breath caught in her throat. Music poured from within, the steady rhythm of a live band, while clusters of people mingled across her lawn, laughing, toasting, moving about as though they belonged there. The barn her father had built, the barn she had spent years planning to restore, had been transformed into a wedding venue without so much as a word to her, and as she sat gripping the steering wheel in disbelief, she wondered if perhaps she had taken a wrong turn into someone else's life. She parked hastily and stepped out, the gravel crunching under her shoes, and immediately a man in a black suit with an earpiece approached her with the brisk confidence of security detail. "Ma'am, the event is in progress. Guests only beyond this point," he said, his tone polite but firm as though he were guarding the entrance to a hotel ballroom rather than standing in front of her barn. Marian's voice faltered with indignation as she explained that this was her property, her barn, but the man only gave a rehearsed smile and replied, "I'll need to see proof of that, ma'am, because our records indicate this venue has been booked under contract for tonight's wedding reception. Please don't cause a disturbance." His words struck her like ice water. Not only was he refusing her entry, he was speaking as if the building no longer belonged to her, as if her identity as owner could be dismissed with a shrug. Pushing past him, ignoring his protests, she crossed the threshold of the barn and was nearly overwhelmed by the scene inside. The wide space had been decorated with garlands and flowers, its rough wooden beams softened by cascades of fabric, and at the center stood a bride in white laughing beside a groom as photographers circled them. Guests applauded when the band struck up another tune, and waiters moved between the tables balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres. Not a single person turned to question who Marian was, as though her presence in her own barn were the intrusion and not the event itself. She felt a dizzying mixture of anger and disorientation, her mind racing with questions that had no immediate answers. Who had arranged this? Who had given permission? How could anyone have entered her locked barn, decorated it, and filled it with paying customers in the span of hours without her knowledge? When she demanded to see whoever was responsible, one of the event organizers, an impeccably dressed woman with a clipboard, approached with a professional smile that barely masked irritation. "Mrs. Hall, correct?" she asked, glancing at the name written on her sheet. "You're listed as the property owner and host. Everything is in order. We've had access since yesterday." The Homeowners Association facilitated the agreement and filed all the necessary paperwork. Marion's heart sank as she heard those words. The HOA, the very organization she had always regarded as a distant annoyance, had apparently authorized strangers to occupy her barn as though it were theirs to lease. And what made it worse was the organizers' calm certainty that Marion herself had signed off on it. Before she could gather herself to argue, a guest clinked a glass to announce a toast, and the barn erupted in cheers, drowning her words. She backed out into the night air, shaking, her mind reeling with outrage. But the shock was only compounded when she noticed an envelope taped neatly to her front door, a letterhead stamped with the familiar crest of the Homeowners Association. She tore it open with trembling hands and read, "Dear Mrs. Hall, we are pleased to confirm the successful registration of your barn as a community venue under the HOA's Cultural Initiatives Program. As the designated property owner, you are responsible for all applicable tax assessments and liabilities. The projected municipal tax bill for the fiscal year is $60,000, payable within 90 days. Thank you for your cooperation in strengthening our neighborhood's cultural profile." The words blurred as she read them again and again, the sheer audacity of the message sinking in. Not only had they commandeered her barn without asking, they had shifted the financial burden onto her, presenting it as though she had willingly joined some civic project. Standing in the fading light, with the sound of laughter and music spilling from her barn, Marion felt a rare, raw helplessness creep into her bones. Her father's words about buildings carrying memory echoed bitterly now, because the barn was carrying someone else's memory, someone else's joy, and she had been relegated to an outsider on her own land. She thought of calling the police, but she imagined the chaos of trying to explain to officers that an entire wedding party had been staged illegally on her property, armed with paperwork she had never signed but which would no doubt appear legitimate to anyone not deeply familiar with the situation. She thought of confronting the HOA directly, storming into their office that very night, but she knew their doors would be closed, their voicemail boxes full, their authority shielded by jargon and bureaucracy. So she did what she could in the moment. She stood on the edge of her driveway, forcing herself to breathe steadily as she watched strangers dance inside the building that had once been her father's pride. And she vowed that she would not let this stand. The $60,000 bill in her hand was more than money. It was a message that the association believed her powerless, that they could manipulate her identity, forge her consent, and exploit her silence. She understood then that this was not a misunderstanding to be corrected with a polite phone call. It was the opening move in a deliberate takeover, and if she did not fight back, she would lose not just the barn, but every piece of ground she had left. On Monday morning, Marion walked into the HOA office with the letter still folded in her hand, her pulse hammering as though she were walking into a courtroom rather than a small suite tucked inside a bland commercial building near the interstate. But the sensation of stepping into enemy territory was undeniable, for even the receptionist's glance seemed to carry that smug detachment of someone who already knew how the conversation would unfold. She explained through clenched teeth that she was the owner of the barn on Harker Lane, and that she demanded an immediate explanation for the unauthorized event and the outrageous tax bill that had followed. But the receptionist only tapped her nails on the desk and said that the president of the association would see her shortly, as though Marion were a supplicant waiting for permission to be heard. After 10 uneasy minutes, she was ushered into a small conference room where a tall man in a navy suit sat with a stack of folders before him, his posture relaxed, his expression calm to the point of arrogance, and when he extended his hand, he introduced himself as David Randolph, president of the association, a name Marion had seen occasionally on flyers and newsletters that she never bothered to read. She wasted no time with pleasantries, setting the letter on the table and demanding to know how the association could possibly claim ownership over her barn or assume the right to lease it for events without her consent. But Randolph merely leafed through one of the folders and slid a document across the table toward her. It was a contract, thick with fine print, bearing the HOA's stamp and, most chillingly, her own signature at the bottom, scrawled in a way that looked authentic enough to make her stomach twist. "You agreed," he said smoothly, his voice carrying the kind of infuriating calm that comes from rehearsed authority, "to allow the association to manage your barn as part of our community enhancement program. In exchange, you receive tax credits and exposure for your property." It is all here in black and white. Marian stared at the paper, her mind racing, because while the signature resembled hers, she knew instantly that she had never put pen to this document, had never even seen it before this moment. And yet, to anyone else, it would appear as incontrovertible proof that she had consented. When she accused him of forgery, his smile barely flickered, and he leaned back in his chair with that maddening air of patience reserved for difficult children. "Mrs. Hall, these are legal documents, notarized and filed with the county," he replied. "If you wish to challenge them, you are of course entitled to seek counsel, but in the meantime the association will continue its operations as planned. The community has already benefited from the events hosted on your property, and frankly, it would be disruptive to attempt to reverse what has been agreed." She pressed him, voice rising, demanding to know who had authorized entry into her barn, who had hired security to bar her from her own doors, and who had arranged the absurd $60,000 tax assessment, but Randolph simply folded his hands and said, "Taxes are determined by usage, not sentiment. Once a property is designated as a commercial venue, municipal assessments are adjusted accordingly. If you had read the bylaws, you would understand that the association has full authority to designate underutilized structures for community use. It is not personal, Mrs. Hall, it is policy." The words rang in her ears with mechanical cruelty, and though she tried to argue that the barn was not under their jurisdiction, that her father had built it long before the neighborhood was swallowed by the associations. "Sprawl," Randolph countered with another sheet of paper, an amendment to the bylaws, passed quietly the previous year, which claimed that all properties within the boundary of the neighborhood fell under HOA oversight regardless of individual exemptions or prior agreements. "You see," he said almost kindly, "we anticipate confusion from time to time, but ultimately the community's growth requires adaptability, and that means all of us must participate." The condescension in his tone cut deeper than the words themselves, for it carried the unspoken belief that Marian, isolated and grieving and alone, was no match for the machinery of the HOA, that she would exhaust herself fighting only to discover that the rules had been written to ensure her loss. She left the office trembling, the forged contract burning in her memory, and as she drove back home she felt the weight of a trap closing around her. Not only had they stolen her barn in practice, they had erected a wall of bureaucracy so thick that every attempt to resist would require months of costly legal battles, and she knew from the cold certainty in Randolph's eyes that this was deliberate. They expected her to fold, to abandon the fight under the pressure of escalating fees and mounting isolation. That evening she sat at her kitchen table, the document spread before her like evidence in a trial, and she realized she was already being treated as guilty, already painted as complicit in agreements she had never made. Her phone buzzed with a voicemail from an unknown number, a polite but firm reminder that her first installment of the tax bill would be due in 30 days. The trap was not only legal, it was financial, and she could almost feel the noose tightening with every passing hour. As night fell, she walked out to the barn and stood in the doorway, staring at the remnants of the wedding still scattered across the floor, discarded napkins, petals, a champagne cork rolling into the shadows. The sight filled her with both fury and despair, because it proved the depth of the invasion, the intimacy of the theft. This was no longer her private refuge. It had been staged, occupied, and exploited as though she were irrelevant. Yet, as she stood there, fists clenched, she felt a quiet surge of resolve beneath the fear. They had underestimated her. They thought she would crumble beneath paperwork and intimidation. But she knew the barn better than they did, knew every board and nail and flaw, and she knew the truth of her own hand, the truth that could never be forged, no matter how convincing. Their signatures looked on paper. She whispered to the darkness that she would not surrender. Not to Randolph, not to the association, and not to the falsehoods that sought to erase her. It was the first step of defiance, quiet and private, but it was the spark that would carry her forward into a battle she never imagined she would have to fight. Marian did not sleep much in the days that followed, her nights punctuated by restless pacing and the constant review of documents she knew in her bones were false, but which appeared to hold the weight of authority in every line. She could not shake the image of Randolph's calm expression across the conference table, the quiet confidence of a man who believed that rules were weapons and that she, as an isolated individual, had no shield against them. Yet exhaustion did not bring surrender. If anything, it hardened her determination, for she realized that the only way to fight an enemy that operated through paperwork and signatures was to outmatch them with proof more solid than their forgeries. And she decided that she would begin, where her father had always told her to begin, with records, with dates, with the kind of tangible evidence that could not be twisted by the smooth language of bylaws. She drove to the county clerk's office with a stack of her own files under her arm, determined to track every change made to her property in the past decade. The clerk, a tired woman with glasses perched precariously at the tip of her nose, looked up in weary recognition when Marian explained the situation, as though she had heard versions of the same story before, and after a few taps at her computer, she produced a printout that made Marian's stomach clench. According to county records, her barn had indeed been reclassified 6 months earlier from residential outbuilding to community venue, a change signed off by the HOA and filed under her name. She stared at the sheet in disbelief, for not only was the signature a copy of hers, but her professional license number as an architect was written beneath it, a detail that turned the forgery from a simple theft into something far more insidious. Someone within the HOA had obtained her license information, the number she had guarded carefully through years of professional practice, and used it to legitimize the transfer, knowing full well that any bureaucrat glancing at the file would see the endorsement of a licensed architect and accept it without question. She felt the blood drain from her face as the realization hit her. This was not simply a matter of fraud against her as a property owner, it was a deliberate hijacking of her professional identity. They were not just exploiting her barn, they were exploiting her career, her credibility, her name. She asked the clerk for every record attached to the reclassification and was handed a folder thick with copies, contracts signed, permits issued, even receipts of payments made to vendors for community event coordination. On several of the invoices, her name appeared as the approving officer, a sickening reminder that someone had woven her identity into every corner of the scheme, leaving her vulnerable not only to financial ruin, but to professional disgrace. If the state licensing board were to believe she had participated in unauthorized projects or tax evasion, she could lose the license that was the foundation of her livelihood. For a moment she considered leaving the building, abandoning the whole fight before it consumed her, but then the clerk leaned closer and lowered her voice. "You're not the first," she said quietly, her eyes darting toward the door. "They've done this before. To others who lived here longer than they liked, people think it's just about dues or fences, but when they want a property badly enough, they find ways to make it theirs. Most people give up. Don't let them scare you into silence." The words struck her like a lifeline in a sea of doubt. She was not imagining the scale of the conspiracy. It was real, and others had suffered before her. Yet, unlike those who gave up, she still had a chance to fight because she had caught them mid-play, with evidence fresh and motives exposed. She left the office with the folder pressed to her chest, her mind already spinning through strategies. That evening at her kitchen table, she spread the documents out in sequence, examining the dates and signatures, and she noticed a pattern that chilled her further. The majority of the forged papers were dated on days she had been traveling out of. State for work. She still had the receipts, the boarding passes, even hotel invoices stored meticulously in her records, and suddenly she saw a way forward. If she could prove that she had been physically absent on the days the documents were supposedly signed, she could demonstrate not only forgery, but intent to deceive. For whoever had crafted the scheme had deliberately chosen those dates believing no. One would scrutinize them. As the night wore on, she marked each discrepancy with a red pen, her anger sharpening into focus, and she felt the stirrings of something she had not felt since before her husband's death. Purpose, raw and undeniable. She realized that the association had made a critical mistake. In their eagerness to use her license, they had tethered the fraud too closely to her professional life, forgetting that architects lived and died by documentation, by proof of presence, by records so detailed that no forged line could survive under scrutiny. They had underestimated the one person who could dissect their lies with surgical precision, and Marian vowed she would use every ounce of her training to dismantle them. But resolve alone could not shield her from the weight of isolation. The following day she attempted to speak with neighbors, hoping to find allies, but she was met with uneasy smiles and evasive words. One man muttered that the barn had always seemed underused and that maybe the association was right to put it to better purpose. Another avoided her gaze entirely, repeating that he didn't want trouble. She felt the sting of betrayal, for it was clear that the HOA had already poisoned the well, convincing others that she was the one in the wrong, that she was the obstacle to community progress. Rumors moved faster than facts, and she realized she would have to stand alone in public opinion until she could expose the truth in court. That night, as she walked to the barn, she noticed subtle changes that deepened her unease. A new lock had been installed on the side door, one she did not recognize, and faint tire tracks in the dirt suggested that vehicles had been there while she was away. Inside, she found another event being prepared. Tables stacked near the wall, crates of wine bottles labeled with dates for the coming weekend. The boldness of it stunned her. Despite her protests, despite her confrontation with Randolph, the HOA was moving forward as if she were irrelevant, as if her defiance were a mere inconvenience they could swat aside. She stood in the dim light of the barn, surrounded by the evidence of their intrusion, and she swore to herself that this would not be allowed to continue. She would gather her proof. She would present it with the clarity only she could command, and she would show them that they had chosen the wrong target when they chose her. In that moment, the battle shifted. It was no longer about preserving sentimental memory or resisting an outrageous tax bill. It became about survival, professional, financial, personal. If she failed, she would lose not just the barn but her career, her credibility, the foundation of her life. But if she succeeded, she would not only reclaim what was hers, she would dismantle the illusion of invulnerability that the association wielded like a weapon. The midpoint of her fight had arrived, and though fear lingered at the edges of her resolve, she understood with crystalline clarity that there was no path back to the quiet life she had once lived. There was only the storm, and she would have to walk into it armed with nothing but her determination and the truth carved into the documents that bore her stolen name. The days after Marian uncovered the forged records at the county office carried with them a strange duality, for while she felt empowered by the proof of her absence during the supposed signing of the documents, she also sensed the weight of the HOA, tightening its grip around her with an aggressiveness that seemed almost theatrical in its precision. It was as though they had anticipated her resistance and had prepared an arsenal of new measures designed not simply to intimidate, but to exhaust, to wear down her willpower until she conceded out of sheer fatigue. The first indication came one morning when she left her house to find a bright orange notice pinned to her fence, stamped with the HOA insignia, declaring that her barn had failed a safety compliance review and that immediate upgrades were required to meet fire code standards for public events. The irony stung, for she had never consented to the barn's use as an event space, and yet the notice listed her as the responsible party for violations that had only come into existence because of the association's unlawful reclassification. When she stormed into the office later that day demanding an explanation, Randolph was conveniently unavailable, but a younger board member with a smooth, dismissive smile informed her that failure to comply with the safety notice would result in escalating daily fines and eventual lien placement on her property. "We take community safety very seriously," he intoned, sliding a pamphlet across the counter that listed costly upgrades such as sprinkler systems, commercial-grade exits, and professional inspections. "Surely, as an architect, you understand the importance of regulation." Marion left the office trembling with fury, realizing that they were now turning her own profession against her, twisting her expertise into a weapon by which to accuse her of negligence if she resisted. The pressure did not end there. Within days, whispers began to circulate among her neighbors, the kind of half-truths and insinuations that spread quickly through tight-knit communities where fear of conflict often outweighed loyalty to the truth. A woman she barely knew stopped her at the market to murmur sympathetically, "I heard you're in trouble with taxes, dear. It's such a shame," while another neighbor avoided eye contact entirely, pretending not to hear Marion's greeting. It was clear that the association had begun a campaign of character assassination, painting her as irresponsible, uncooperative, even dishonest, until the community that might have stood behind her instead began to distance themselves, afraid of being tainted by association with her supposed failures. The sense of siege grew worse when, late one evening, she returned from a client meeting to find two men in reflective vests parked at the end of her driveway beside a truck marked Neighborhood Security. They stepped forward as she slowed her car, motioning for her to roll down the window. One of them asked for her identification under the pretense of a routine verification, claiming that the association had implemented new measures to ensure that all residents were properly documented. The casual authority in his tone made her skin crawl, for it was not the police demanding her ID but a private force conjured by the HOA, and though she refused and told them to leave, she could not shake the chill of being singled out, as though she were already an outsider on her own property. The following morning, another envelope appeared in her mailbox, this one a formal warning that she had obstructed community security personnel and that any further non-compliance could result in escalated enforcement. Marion began documenting everything, filling a notebook with dates, names, and descriptions of each incident, for she knew instinctively that the pattern was as important as the individual events. Each notice, each rumor, each act of intimidation was a part of a calculated effort to break her down, and she would need to show the cumulative force of it to any judge who might one day hear her case. Yet, no matter how meticulous her records, the emotional toll mounted. She awoke at night, certain she had heard footsteps near the barn, and more than once she found subtle evidence of intrusion. A chair moved, a tool displaced, the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering near the doorway. The message was clear. She was being watched, monitored, harassed, all under the guise of community management. The climax of this second wave of escalation came when she received notice that the HOA had filed suit against her in civil court, accusing her of defamation and obstruction of community initiatives. The language of the complaint was galling, for it accused her of spreading falsehoods about the association, of interfering with planned events, and even of endangering community reputation by refusing to cooperate. It was a masterstroke of inversion, turning her role as victim into that of aggressor, and for a moment she felt the ground tilt beneath her as though reality itself had been rewritten in their favor. If she could be cast as the villain in official filings, Then the uphill battle she faced was steeper than she had dared imagine. Yet even as the weight of their pressure bore down, something inside her refused to collapse. She sat at her kitchen table once more, surrounded by forged contracts, fraudulent notices, and her own growing stack of counter-evidence, and she told herself that this was no longer simply about a barn or a tax bill. It was about truth against lies, autonomy against manipulation, and the right of an individual not to be consumed by the machinery of an association that had forgotten its mandate and transformed itself into a predator. They were escalating, yes, but with each new tactic they revealed their desperation, and with every desperate move they gave her more threads to pull. She knew the storm would worsen before it broke, but she was determined that when it did, she would be the one still standing. The day of the hearing arrived with the heavy stillness of a storm about to break, and as Marian entered the courthouse with her folder clutched tightly against her side, she felt as though every step echoed louder than it should, reverberating not only through the tiled hallway but through the months of fear, anger, and resolve that had brought her here. The courtroom itself was small, paneled in dark wood that smelled faintly of varnish, and when she sat at the defendant's table beside her attorney she could feel the weight of eyes upon her. The board members of the HOA, dressed neatly as though this were nothing more than another meeting, and Randolph himself seated at the center, his posture exuding calm assurance as though he were presiding over an outcome already decided. The judge, a woman with stern eyes and a voice that carried easily across the chamber, began with the formality of procedure, and then the arguments commenced. The association's lawyer moved first, presenting a stack of contracts and notices that had already haunted Marian's nights. With careful intonation, he described her as a willing participant in the Community Enhancement Program, a property owner who had signed agreements but later grown resentful, spreading false claims and attempting to sabotage events. He held up photographs of weddings and receptions inside the barn, pointing to her name on the paperwork as though it were irrefutable proof, and his words painted her not as a victim, but as an unreliable woman who sought to rewrite history to her own convenience. Each sentence was polished, each gesture precise, and as the documents were entered into evidence, Marian felt the cold weight of their strategy. Drown the court in the appearance of legitimacy, overwhelm with paperwork until truth seemed like a feeble protest against bureaucracy. When it was her turn, she rose slowly, hands trembling only slightly as she placed her own folder on the stand. Her attorney guided her through the testimony, but it was Marian herself who carried the weight of the defense, her voice steady as she explained that every signature in those documents was false, that the dates chosen for the supposed agreements coincided with her professional travel out of state. She produced hotel receipts, airline boarding passes, and invoices from architectural projects that proved she had been hundreds of miles away when the papers claimed she stood in the HOA office signing contracts. The judge leaned forward, studying the pages, her expression unreadable, and Marian pressed on, pointing out the identical pressure marks on the signatures, the repeated patterns of ink flow that suggested a single forgery process rather than authentic, varied handwriting. The pivotal moment came when she introduced the discovery that had shaken her the most, her professional license number, copied onto documents without her consent, used to authorize permits that would never have passed scrutiny otherwise. She explained with the authority of someone who had lived her career in the world of codes and certifications that no licensed architect would have approved such shoddy paperwork, that the very presence of her number was evidence not of consent, but of theft. A murmur ran through the courtroom, and even Randolph's calm mask flickered as the judge asked pointedly how the HOA had come to possess and apply a number that should have been known only to Marian and the state licensing board. The association's lawyer attempted to recover, dismissing the travel receipts as irrelevant and suggesting that Marian could have authorized the documents remotely. But the judge's expression grew sharper, and when Marian produced her notebook of recorded harassment, dates of false inspections, notices pinned to her fence, Even the so-called security check where she had been ordered to show identification, the pattern became impossible to ignore. It was not the image of a woman acting against her community, but of a community organization acting ruthlessly against one of its own, constructing a facade of legitimacy while hiding a campaign of intimidation. The judge's ruling was concise but devastating in its clarity. The court recognized that the contracts were fraudulent, the reclassification of the barn invalid, and the tax assessments unenforceable. The judge further ordered an injunction against the HOA, prohibiting them from entering or using Marion's property in any capacity, and referred the matter for investigation by the district attorney's office on suspicion of forgery and fraud. Marion sat frozen as the words sank in, the tension of months uncoiling all at once, and for the first time she saw Randolph's composure falter, his jaw tightening as the gavel struck finality into the air. The courtroom emptied slowly, the board members whispering furiously among themselves, but Marion remained seated, clutching her folder, her mind still catching up with the reality that she had won. The barn was hers again, the lies had been pierced, and though the battle had left her exhausted, she knew she had faced not only the weight of bureaucracy but the weight of her own fear and had refused to yield. The days that followed the ruling felt strangely quiet, as though the air around Marion had been cleared of a pressure she had grown so accustomed to that its absence seemed almost unreal. For the first time in months, she walked to the barn without bracing herself for signs of intrusion, and when she opened the heavy wooden doors, she found only silence and dust. No tables stacked for events, no crates of wine, no strangers treating the space as their own. The emptiness was not unsettling. It was liberating, a reminder that the building belonged once again to her alone. And as she stood in the cool dimness, she felt both the fragility and the strength of what she had reclaimed. She began to imagine how to restore it properly, not with garlands or tables, but with light, with workbenches, with shelves for models and drawings, so that the barn would finally fulfill the purpose she and her father had once dreamed for it. Word of the verdict spread quickly, and although many neighbors avoided direct apologies, she noticed the change in the way they looked at her, the guarded suspicion replaced by something closer to respect, even admiration. One evening, an elderly neighbor approached with a hesitant smile and said softly that she had been brave, braver than most, and that perhaps now others would find the courage to speak about what the association had done in the past. Marion nodded, not out of triumph, but out of quiet recognition that her struggle had become larger than herself. She knew the investigation into Randolph and the board was only beginning, and that the system would not reform overnight. But she also knew that the illusion of their untouchable authority had been shattered, and that was enough for now. On a late afternoon, she set a chair outside the barn and sat watching the light change over the fields, the same view her father had once cherished, and she realized that the barn had survived not only storms of weather, but storms of human greed and manipulation. It remained, scarred yet steadfast, and so did she. The ordeal had cost her peace, time, and trust, but in return it had given her something unexpected, the certainty that she could endure, that she could stand alone against forces larger than herself and still protect what mattered. As dusk settled and the first stars appeared, she whispered to the silence that the barn was safe. Her life was her own again, and the future, though uncertain, finally felt like it belonged to her.